Hey, and welcome back, Modern Math Teacher. I'm your host, Kristen Moore, and today we're diving into one of the most powerful tools in your teaching toolkit. We're talking about mathematical discourse, aka discussions in your math classroom. Now, I know that getting students to talk about math can sometimes feel like pulling teeth, right? But when it's done right, the results are just incredible. Math discourse not only boosts your student engagement, but also deepens understanding and helps students build essential communication skills. All things we are looking to bolster in our classrooms. In today's episode, we're going to explore strategies for fostering meaningful mathematical conversations in your classroom using none other than the 5 practices for orchestrating productive mathematical discussions. Whew, that's a mouthful, but it's an amazing read. These practices in here are game changers. And by the end of this episode, you'll have practical tips that you can use starting in your next lesson. So let's get started. To kick things off, let's talk about why discourse matters so much in the classroom. When our students are discussing their thinking, they're not just sharing their answers. They're exploring different perspectives, they're defending their reasoning, and they're learning from one another. This process helps them to solidify their understanding and uncover misconceptions, all while making math more interactive and engaging. But to get the most out of math discourse and discussions in your classroom, we need to be intentional about how we structure these conversations. And that's where the 5 practices comes in. Now, if you don't know this, the 5 practices of orchestrating productive mathematical discussions developed by Margaret Peg Smith and Mary Kay Stein offers a framework for students to engage meaningfully through math conversations. We're going to break down each of these practices and talk about how you can apply it in your classroom. The first practice we're going to talk about today is anticipation. Okay. Before you even begin to pose a problem to your students, take some time to think about the different ways that your students might approach solving it. What strategies will they be using? What mistakes might they make? By anticipating these different responses, you'll be better prepared to guide the discussion and address any misconceptions as they arise. For example, if you're working on a problem involving quadratic functions, think about the different methods students might use, whether that's factoring, completing the square, using the quad formula, and the potential pitfalls with each of those approaches. Okay, so that's anticipating. It's your teacher job to think before you even pose the question. Practice number 2, monitoring. Okay. So once your students are working on this problem in your classroom, your job is to monitor their progress. That's what we do as teachers. You are going to be circulating the room, listening to their discussions, and taking note of the different strategies that they are using. This practice is crucial because it allows you to gather evidence of student thinking in real time. Okay. So while you're monitoring, you can be asking probing questions to push their thinking further, and you can also provide them hints when needed. Remember, your goal here is not to solve the problem for them, but to support them as they work and problem solve through it. Now, that brings us to teacher or practice number 3. As the teacher, we need to think about selecting, okay? So the next practice involves selecting which student solutions you want to highlight during the discussion. This selection could be strategic, right? You're not just picking the correct answers, but rather a range of approaches that will help illuminate the key ideas in this activity. For example, if you are discussing different methods for solving a system of equations, right? You might select one student who used substitution and another who used elimination, maybe even a student who made a common error that can spark a really valuable discussion, okay? So, you as the teacher, as you're monitoring, you're selecting which of these answers you want to pull forth into the conversation. And that brings us to practice number 4, which is sequencing. So, after you have selected the responses, you want to think about the order in which you'll present them to the class. The sequencing of student work is critical because it can help build that understanding in a logical way for your students. You might, for example, start with a simpler approach to lay the foundation, then move on to more complex strategies. Or maybe you want to start with an incorrect method and then move to correct ones, using that mistake as a learning opportunity. The goal is to sequence the responses in a way that builds towards a deeper understanding of the math concepts at hand. Now, when I am using these 5 practices in my classroom, I will often be walking around with a clipboard with what I've already anticipated the students are going to be doing, how they might approach it, how they might struggle, maybe some questions I want to ask them. And I'm going to go around the room, select answers I want, and jot down on my not my notebook, my clipboard, what I want the order to be for when I'm going to have them present. Okay. And then it comes into practice number 5, which is connecting. Okay. So the last practice is about connecting all of those different strategies and solutions back to the key mathematical ideas and concepts of your lesson. This is where the magic happens. So, as you help facilitate and guide this discussion, you're helping students see the connections between all the different methods and understand how they all relate to those underlying concepts. For example, again, if we're going back to solving quadratic equations, right, you might help students see how factoring, completing the square, and using the quad formula are all interconnected methods for finding the roots of an equation. All right, so those are our 5 practices. Again, they are anticipating, monitoring, selecting, sequencing, and number 5, connecting. Now that we've covered the 5 practices, let's talk about how you can implement them in your classroom without feeling overwhelmed, right? It is important to start small. If you've never used these 5 practices before, start small. Choose one lesson or problem that you think could benefit from a more structured discussion and focus on just maybe even just 1 or 2 of the practices at first, okay? So maybe you start by anticipating and monitoring for it. And then you gradually work your way up to selecting and sequencing and connecting, incorporating all 5 of those at once. The key is to make these practices a habit over time so they become a natural part of your teaching. Okay. Now, these 5 practices are amazing, but let's take a moment to address some common challenges that teachers face when they try to implement these practices. Now, one challenge that I hear pretty often is that students are reluctant to participate in discussions, especially if they are not confident in their answers, right? And especially if you teach algebra 2, you know you're dealing with a lot of math trauma and anxiety that's just built up over the years. So we know it can be hard to get them to confidently contribute to the conversation. To help with this, I want you to consider creating a classroom culture where mistakes are valued as learning opportunities. You might even start your discussions with a low risk question or a warm up activity that just gets everybody talking in the classroom. And remember, it's okay if not every student is going to speak during every discussion. That's just not going to happen. Your goal, though, is to create a space where all students feel comfortable sharing their thinking, even if they're just doing a turn and talk and sharing their thinking with a partner at first. Now, another challenge that we face, no matter what, is time, right? It's managing the time it takes to facilitate these discussions. My advice here would be to be selective about when and where you use the 5 practices. Maybe not every lesson needs a full blown discussion, but for those key moments when you really want to deepen the understanding, the time investment of having that discussion is well worth it. And as you become more familiar with these practices, you'll find that you don't necessarily have to add a lot to your lessons. You just kind of change the way you use the time that you've already got. All right. So that is the 5 practices in a nutshell. Using these 5 practices, you are going to boost student engagement by getting your students talking, thinking, problem solving, and communicating about mathematics. So that's a wrap for today's episode on boosting our student engagement through discourse and discussions. I really hope that you are feeling inspired to try out the 5 practices in your classroom and see the impact that they can have on your students' understanding and engagement. If you don't already have a copy of this amazing book, I'm going to link to it here in the show notes. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the Modern Math Teacher podcast so that you never miss out on any other episodes. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep fostering those powerful conversations in your classroom. And as always, keep it real.